Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to part 4 of the Trivium Modern Review. And presents the third part of the Trivium, which is rhetoric. And this is one of the weakest elements that we have in the modern world. Rhetoric was the study of and the practice of speaking publicly to convince people of things. So it was very specifically a sort of political or cultural power subject. And this is because if you were educated in the ancient world, as I mentioned before, you were by definition an important person. As an important person, what do? You're going to be arguing things, trying to convince people, trying to get your ideas to be manifest in the world. And one of the primary ways that you did this for, the first few millennia of human histories is through the spoken word, because written communication was, while present, was less important for governing and for achieving the ends that you might, because court cases were argued publicly. Famously, the trial of Socrates, which you can read, you can see rhetorical tricks in there. But fundamentally, it was considered to be perhaps the single most important subject for any educated person to master, because it was the path to power, basically. And so they really, the degree to which this was the most significant aspect of education, you can hardly overstate that. People studied famous speeches, they practiced speaking. You can already see this in the time of Plato, because many of his dialogues have these speeches or rehearsals of speeches or the practices of speeches. So if you read, of course, the most famous one in sort of the world of Western philosophy, the Symposium, they're practicing or rehearsing or giving public speeches in there, in this case on the nature of love. And that would be both an entertainment, which is important, but also a rehearsal, a practice, a way of expressing yourself. And basically, to a very large degree, because of modern technology, because we came to emphasize literacy much more than we did the spoken word, and because we moved from small group government or small sort of oligarchic or totalitarian systems, which even in the democracy of Greece didn't have that many participants, to systems that have much larger, many more people you have to communicate with, the tools of rhetoric, which is speaking in front of people, gave way to literacy, which means you can distribute a text to a lot more people. So if you have Luther's famous theses, these are going to be distributed in writing. That's why they were so damning and so effective, because he could only speak to so many people. Those people could spread the word, but this is very difficult. When they're written down, now they can be reproduced. Wow, it's a world of literacy. The rules of the games have changed to a certain extent. So, with that in mind, what does this have to do with the modern age? And you can say, all right, well, let's get rid of rhetoric. But I think the key element here, or a key element, is that speaking is still hugely important. In fact, the revival of podcasts, the revival of audiobooks, the notion that oral culture really does matter has been coming back quite powerfully in the last decade or so, as people recognize that, hey, literacy is great, but it's not everything. Also, the means of communication, like of being able to do digital recording like this and being able to broadcast spoken word to a lot of people, has made the ability to present yourself in an oral format much more important again. And people are rediscovering what the ancients knew, that rhetoric matters. So on a grand scale, this is coming back into focus. I think more importantly, and this goes right back to where we were with literacy, and of course this is specifically what the ancients were concerned with, is the capacity to express oneself. For them, to be able to speak well was to be able to have efficacy in the world. This has not changed. It's unlikely that we're going to be a senator or a general or a tyrant. Let's hope we're not going to be tyrants, and good Lord, who wants to be a general? But, right, so those roles are probably not there for us. However, the need to communicate clearly, to have efficacy in the world I don't see why it would be any less important, why this is any less significant. Indeed, if you believe in the democratization of education and the diffusion of power into lots of people as opposed to in just a few, then the ability of individuals to speak for themselves, express themselves, and understand themselves is more important than ever. And so what we've lost in this capacity of rhetoric and the study of rhetoric and the paying attention to this is that sense of power. And so I see this all the time. I feel it at times, of course. But if you've ever tried, you've said to yourself, wow, I have something I want to communicate, but I don't know how to find the words for it. Or you say, I have a concept, but I can't phrase it right. Or you're trying to explain something to somebody that you feel quite strongly. And you realize as you're trying to explain it that, wow, I really don't have that great a grasp on this subject as I thought. These are all examples of the failure of rhetoric, the failure of our capacity to put into words and to meaningfully communicate our concepts, our ideas, our thoughts, our emotions. This is just a repeat, of course, of the literacy part of this. But I would say in some ways the rhetoric is more important because we deal with people and we speak to people. We speak a lot, or generally on average, we do a lot of speaking to people. And again, by the way, move to a country where you don't speak the language very well, and you will discover how very, very frustrating it is to not be able to communicate clearly what is in your mind, to even very basic things or subtle and complicated things. And so this incapacity is just disabling. And I don't want to put this as forcefully as possible without overstating it, but I do feel this quite powerfully because I would see this with my students continuously in class for years and years that I taught, that they would have ideas, they would have things, and they would raise their hand or they would try to communicate it, and you would just see them struggling and then failing, and you're like, oh. And then over time, with practice and with greater literacy, with greater time to reflect, then they could get it out. Then they would be able to express themselves. And so this, to me, is what the core of rhetoric in the modern world is about. How do I express myself clearly and functionally in speech, which again is we're much more likely to do than in writing. And conversely, how do I listen and understand, and what do I listen for when I'm taking in other people's speech, what they're trying to communicate, and how I listen. And I would like to say, I've talked a little bit about people like in the logic section and in the writing section, people are trying to mislead us with propaganda. This time I really want to focus, although of course people are trying to mislead us with speech, just as they're trying to mislead us in writing. But let's talk about, I think, the more common situation, which is where, no, we are trying to communicate, or at least we think we're trying to communicate. And I want to assume that we're dealing with good actors, people who don't have exterior motives. They don't, they're just trying to, how can we communicate more clearly in an environment that's positive and helpful and uplifting. And this takes a couple of techniques that like I said, we've kind of lost. First, and I don't know if it's foremost, but first, and this is an important one, is we need to pay attention to the words that we use. I know that sounds strange, but what happens, particularly in speech, you also see this in writing, but in writing you can stop, you can revise, you can go back. In speech, I think we've developed very impatient habits. We want people to express themselves clearly. We want them to do it quickly. We want them to get it over with. What do you have to say? And so people feel that, or they feel nervous, particularly when they're trying to express themselves about something they care deeply, and this causes them to rush. And when you rush, it's hard to pause and go, I don't want this word. I want to weigh this, and select the right word or the correct phrase. And so what you'll hear people fall back on is cliches. They'll fall back on stock phrases that are in their minds, and so they can just repeat them. They can just throw them out there because they don't have to reflect on them, and they're kind of close enough, these kinds of things. And this is intellectually disabling. Because what happens when you have a cliche, when you speak with the cliches, is you're just repeating someone else's thoughts. That's why they're a cliche, because they're common. You know, these are the kinds of phrases you might hear all the time. I like it, for instance, when the cliche has lost meaning. So people say, oh, you know, he's richer than Crassus. And you go, okay, who's Crassus? No one knows who Crassus is anymore. And so you're like, right, so what you're just saying is they're really rich. And so people will say things like this, oh man, they're really rich, or they're richer than this, or they're, you know, and you go, okay, they're really rich. What does that mean? What does really rich actually signify? What are you trying to communicate with that? And so when people use preformed, pre-baked, as it were, concepts to speak, the assumption is, oh, the other person knows what I'm saying because they'll know the cliche. I know what I'm saying, and so now we're communicating. When maybe what we're doing is just passing cliches back and forth and not communicating at all. And so when our vocabularies become overly restricted, and more importantly, maybe we have solid vocabularies or we have a solid stock of phrases, but we don't give ourselves, or we feel like we're in environments where we don't have time to put together original thought or to really think about how we want to express ourselves, then the quality of our communication goes down, and our ability to really express what we're trying to say is like, it just goes away. And I've mentioned this before. I think this is one reason why people say, oh, have you seen this TV show? Like if you meet somebody, oh, have you seen this TV show? Because what they really want to do is shift the conversation onto a ground where they feel comfortable. And if we've both seen the same TV show, and more importantly, if we both like it, now we have a shared vocabulary. And that shared vocabulary lets us communicate, in this case, about a specific subject. And so we go, oh, we know the characters' names, we know the plots, we can talk about what we like about it, and oh, it feels good because we're on firm ground, we have a concrete example of what we can talk about, and we're communicating well, and so we think that we're saying things. And that is, you know, it's great. It makes it very easy. Whether we're actually expressing anything about ourselves that's meaningful, this is where I think I'm always somewhat suspicious. To like or dislike something, I guess, gives you expresses your preferences, and there's a lot to be said for expressing your preferences. But are we really? Again, when I've talked to people about this, if I do follow up, which I rarely do, and say, oh, what do you like about this particular show or movie or something? They'll say, oh, it's great. Right? And I'll go, okay, now I believe them. I absolutely believe them. And I say, okay, what do you find great about it? Oh, it's just so interesting. I'm like, okay. And then you get this sort of vacuous series of sort of synonyms for good or bad, if it's something that they dislike. And and I just sit there and I go, wow, I believe you. I believe you meaningfully. You find this TV show or movie or book or whatever it is moving and powerful, and you think it's important. And I would actually like to know why. And so and if you try and pin people down, I don't mean pin down in a bad way, but if you actually open up the space and say, okay, like really, let's explore this. Let's find out why you find this valuable and moving. Often, and I've had this experience many dozens of times, people get a little nervous. They get upset. They feel like it's sort of prying. You shouldn't be that interested. You should care about, I want to talk about the show. I don't want to talk about why I like the show in any meaningful sense. And notice that distinction. And this is where I think the power of rhetoric really lies. Because if I can express why I like a show and make it meaningful, now I have a chance for efficacy. Now, in a lesser degree, the ancient world, of course, again, they were very interested in sort of political power, grand power, as an expression of themselves. The modern world, again, probably less important for most of us, but the notion of efficacy is no less important. And so generating and developing the capacity to express how we feel, how we view, how we think about the world, again, same thing, is significant. And so an exercise that I was thinking about in these terms is to ask yourself this in your mind. Again, when you read the Platonic dialogues and a lot of other dialogues from the ancient world, they are often premised in this nature of a rehearsal. I was with my friends. We had this debate because we were getting ready to write a book. We were going to the Congress of Vienna, something. And before that, we wanted to kick this around. And so this notion of rehearsing with other people or with yourself is part of learning the art of rhetoric, because you've already thought about it. You've already done some work to think about how would you put this into words. And I know this seems strange, and I was talking to some other people about this a while ago, about 6 months ago, and I asked them, do you spend time formulating ways to express how you feel about things that matter to you? And the argument that I got back was that basically that's unnatural. Like, what you're doing is you're rehearsing your life and making it performative. And you're preparing for things that may or may not happen. And I'm like, I see where that argument comes from. And again, one of the threats of rhetoric is, like I mentioned before, is sophistry, where this just becomes performative. You have other ends, blah, blah. I can understand that argument. It's not entirely without merit. However, I think the more important, or the more significantly to be emphasized, is the notion of you're good at things you practice. You will gain a greater understanding of your thoughts and feelings and of your capacity to express them if you think about them and articulate them to yourself and other people. It's just like anything else. And as you gain that skill, as you gain the capacity to enter situations and feel grounded and express yourself, it gives you a sense of power. And a classic one that's come up for me recently is, two friends in different situations, but they both needed to do the same thing. And this was both related to work, where it's not that their work was terrible or anything, but they wanted to, put some boundaries on and say, hey, this is great, but this isn't working for me. Let's talk about it. Like, they weren't putting any, do this or I'm going to quit. It wasn't a threatening thing. And so we talked about this, and I said, well, tell me how you're feeling, and let's work on putting this into words and how you would articulate this and what you're trying to communicate, what you don't want to see happen, what would be a good outcome. And as we talked through this, they felt really good. And then what the outcome was in both cases is it wasn't even so important what happened with work, although they both had positive outcomes. It was that they felt empowered because they had thought to themselves, wow, I really was able to express clearly in a non-threatening, just aggressive way what I was feeling. And so I felt both good about myself and I felt in control of the situation, in the sense that they controlled them. They didn't control the other person, other people actually, but they controlled themselves. And so, wow, hey presto. And that's what this capacity gives you. It's a sense of power, because you control both yourself and your capacity to express things. You don't feel threatened, you don't get nervous, or you get less nervous, you get less threatened. You have a clearer idea of what you're trying to say and how you want to say it, the kind of words you want to use, the kind of words you want to avoid. And so instead of, in one example of going in and saying, I don't want to work so many hours, I want to work fewer days, that, this schedule can't be working this way, just go in and say, start positive, like, I love the work I'm doing. I just would be helpful for me, and I'll be able to last a lot longer at this job if the schedule is more sustainable. If it's not sustainable, well, it won't sustain. And so is there a way that we can negotiate this? And so, even things about how you pitch the language. Is it pitched in negative terms? Is it pitched in positive terms? Are you making a complaint? Are you providing solutions? Right? All of these sorts of tactics are not, people go, oh, well, you're just trying to manipulate the other person, which could possibly be true. But the sense of power and efficacy that one gains by expressing clearly, but not being crazy, not going out like, oh yeah, I said what I meant, but I was kind of yelling, right? Like, oops, I did feel that way, but I probably didn't need to yell it, right? I kind of lost control of myself. These sorts of situations where you're like, oh, if you can create a situation where you feel grounded and you're able to express yourself clearly, people generally find that very empowering. And that is the power of rhetoric. You're like, oh, even if the outcome isn't what you ideally wanted, the bigger picture is like, I now have a greater sense of myself, my own capacities, and my ability to affect the world with those capacities. This is the power of rhetoric. But one, again, is to choose the right words, to choose the right phrases takes time. And to take that time, you either need to practice and rehearse, although rehearsal, I don't like that word so much. It is practice and sort of kick around the ideas in your own head. Talk to them, talk to other people about these ideas. So you're like, oh yeah, okay, I see. Maybe they feel this way. Oh, this would be a more effective way to present that. And being able to then have the right vocabulary, the right phrases sort of ready to go. So because you've also discovered or explored or have a better sense of how you actually feel and what you would actually like. That kind of thinking, that kind of rhetorical practice was taken absolutely for granted in the ancient world. Like the notion that you would go into any important situation having not rehearsed, having not prepared, having not spent a lot of time thinking and pondering and being ready. It would just be absurd. Like you'd be like going, oh, I'm going to be a professional, baseball player, and I don't need to practice. Right? People would be like, what are you talking about? Of course you need to practice. This is how you develop the art. For some reason, we no longer think of speaking and communicating with people as an art, even though, of course, we do it all the time. We just tend to do it often quite poorly. And one aspect of this where you can see this is, Barzan and lots of other people I've talked about the decline of conversation and of the art of conversation. And, as I do in my conversation, I'd have a whole lecture on conversation where I talk about the spaces tend not to be very helpful, too much noise, too many people, these sorts of issues. Another aspect of it is we just don't practice. We're really out of practice. And so even though a great conversation can be a joy, it's harder when people are simply less adapted to it. They're less used to it. Indeed, one of the things that people have reported because of the COVID lockdown is they just had less access to people, and people got really depressed. All the evidence is, it turns out, not being with people makes people depressed. This is not a shocker, and yet somehow people seemed really surprised. I mean, it made people really depressed. We're still dealing with the mental health outcomes of this, right? So this is, if you struggled with this or struggled with the time or still struggling with this, do not feel bad. It was a real issue for many, basically most people. And one of the elements of this is we like to talk to people. We like to be heard, and we like to be felt to be heard. And it feels good when we can hear other people and we can respond appropriately. And while these sort of capacities and opportunities had been on the decline, man, they just got chopped off. And when we all isolated everybody, it did a couple of things that were very unhelpful. One, of course, isolated us from people. And two, it even reduced the practice that we were getting to a level that was even lower. And so now people often feel nervous and uncomfortable in social situations. They feel awkward. How do you speak to strangers? These things. And there's stuff on YouTube, of course, on the internet about how to be entertaining, how to make a joke, how to do small talk, all this kind of things. No, like this is all wrong, but bad. Well, not all wrong, bad, whatever. But if you like that, that's great too. But the key is, it's like, how do you get a sense of yourself by learning to express yourself? Maybe you're not interested in small talk, right? Maybe that's you just don't care, and so why would you do that? No, the question is like, what is it that you want to communicate, and how do you do it in a way that's effective and makes you feel powerful and good? That's the key. And so when we lost those capacities or they're undermined, it's a self-reinforcing cycle where, I don't feel like I'm communicating very clearly, so I get nervous, so I communicate less well, I've had less practice, so the other person sees I'm getting nervous, they get nervous, and so what we're going to do is make pointless small talk and turn the music up. And then we're both isolated, or all of us feel even more isolated. And that pattern, again, which was already there quite powerfully, was just, put a multiplier on it. And I think this is one of the things I've seen coming out of that as people are getting back together and are spending more time together. You're like, okay, Like, it took a while to kind of get that flywheel up again. It took time, which is not surprising. It's completely understandable. But that power is, I think, necessary for your sense of efficacy, but I just think it's necessary for human health. And the increasing level of isolation that people feel, I think, can, in many parts, be attributed to this sense of lack of capacity. Again, I don't like to criticize the education system all the time, but if you think about the way the modern classroom is structured, most of the time you are being told to sit quietly and do things besides talk to people, which is, not that helpful. We also tend to be age segregated because, so what this means is you tend to spend most of your time with people who are your own age. Now, one of the problems with this is, how do you get models for how to, in this case, speak effectively, to be able to speak clearly, to express yourself clearly, when you're surrounded by people who, give or take, are roughly at your own level. Now, somebody may be better, somebody may be worse. There's always going to be a variable there. Rather than having people who are older, who have more experience in whatever the subject it is, but in this case, of course, it is just rhetoric and speaking, to say, oh, there's a model. Oh, I can raise my band. Oh, they can help me speak more clearly. Right? And the more age segregated you are, the less opportunity you have to interact with people that you can more effectively model your speech patterns, your interpersonal communication patterns on. And of course, as you get older and older, then you just go up with this band. And wow, if you never have classes, if you're never trained, then there you go. This all goes downhill. And hilariously, this is so bad now. Public speaking, even 50 years ago, public speaking was a primary subject in education. Nobody remembered why, of course, but it was still around. But this is pre-COVID, by the way. The college that I taught at unbelievably put public speaking online. I know that sounds like a joke, but it is not a joke. They actually put public speaking as an online course, which, at some point you're like, you're just giving up. They're not even trying anymore, right? It's so silly. And so, but it just showed how much contempt the administration, and I guess the faculty for that matter, had for the subject. They no longer really thought it was a serious subject. So just put it online. Speaking to people publicly, expressing yourself in that sense really doesn't matter that much. So let's just, put it online and forget about it, as if being live with people makes no difference. So again, choosing your words well, choosing your phrases well, spending time reflecting on the things that you might want to express as clearly as you possibly can. This is really the core of rhetoric, again, when tied to things like literacy. So you go, okay, why am I reading these great works of literature? Oh, because you might encounter people who have really clearly expressed concepts that you've been thinking that resonate with you. And then you go, oh yeah, here's that great scene from, Balzac, who has, some speech, and you go, oh, wow, that character really, of course, he has a million characters, but, that character really resonated with me when she said this. I thought, oh, that's how I felt. Now you have a scene, now you have some language, now you can go, oh, and when somebody says, oh, how do you feel about this? You can go, not necessarily going to reproduce a scene from Balzac, although maybe you can do that, but you can go, oh, now I have some language, now I have some phrases, now I have these concepts. And you're like, wow, people will be impressed. And you're like, wow, yeah, you sound impressive. You sound impressive because you've got Balzac doing your speech writing. This is a good trick. Get Balzac to do your speech writing because he could write. Victor Hugo, good choice. Dostoevsky, now you can sound crazy. It's great. Right? So, but this is the idea. You're not out in the world alone. You're not thinking all these thoughts for the first time. You're thinking them for the first time for you. But the shared human experience is going to be been expressed by some of the most brilliant minds, some of the great writers and thinkers and speakers in history. And when you access that and reflect on it, not simply as entertainment, not something out there that's on a test, but something that you can incorporate to your own mind, your own life, your own vocabulary, and then you can recreate it yourself for your own self-expression, hey presto. Now you have this capacity and this power that is, if nothing else, gives you the sense of self-possession, of being able to express yourself clearly. or at least as clearly as possible, or more clearly than you could yesterday. And maybe you'll be more clearly and more powerful in the future. And again, as the examples I use from the friends who were going for various job things, even the process of doing that just made them feel so much better. They're like, oh, if I say, hey, I can't do these hours, and they say, wow, there's really nothing we can do about that. If nothing else, they can say, but I stood up for myself. I spoke what was my truth. Here I go. I can feel good about that. And this, I think, is what's really been taken away from us. And like with writing, but I think even more powerfully, what it communicates to me, the way we have structurally reduced the importance of rhetoric and the teaching of rhetoric and speech and self-expression, is we fundamentally don't care what you have to say. There it is, right? Societally, we talk about democracy, we talk about open societies, we talk about participation. We have this, again, rhetoric at one level. Underneath that rhetoric, what we really say is, however, we really are not going to provide you with the skills. We're not going to emphasize that because we don't think that's very important. We think other things are important. Now, we can talk about what those other things are and how important they are and how effectively they're presented. But I would argue, and I do argue, obviously, in the course of this lecture, that there really isn't a lot more important that you can teach somebody than the capacity to express themselves as clearly and powerfully as possible so that they have efficacy in the world. Doesn't seem that confusing. How much time did you spend on this in school? Think about it. As I was growing up, my entire education, I want to say twice. I can think of 2 times when speaking publicly was a subject that was discussed briefly, and some of the ideas about how you might do it were brought up. That's it. And I was in school for fucking ever, right? Like I was in school for a long time, and you go, wow. And this, by the way, what crystallized, again, moments that crystallized my thoughts is the first time I went to give a public presentation at a professional conference, the person who was speaking before me did the worst possible job of presenting what was actually a pretty good paper, but the way they presented it orally was unbelievable. I mean, it was almost like sitcom, unnervingly, uncomfortably, maddeningly terrible. And I was like, wow, whatever happens, I never want to do that badly, right? I don't want to be that person, because this is just, it was so like, it was just painful to sit there. You felt bad for them because, again, they seemed to have good things to communicate, but they couldn't communicate them. And this sense of being disabled, particularly if you've been in school at that point for, 20 years, and to still have that incapacity, well, this is ungood in so many ways. And so that's why rhetoric is still, I think, vital. For 2,000 years after it was introduced as a subject, and it will remain vital as long as we're allowed to have free communication. Now, again, the flip side of this is if you do not have the capacity to do this, you're not just losing the ability to affect the outside world, you're losing the ability to communicate with yourself, right? If all of the fleeting moments and feelings and emotions and pains and imaginations and desires and pleasures and joys and inspirations, you can't ever express them, then, right, again, it becomes slightly self-alienating. It's not that you don't feel them, it's not that you don't experience them, but you can't cultivate them, you can't share them, you can't, right, all these barriers get placed. And of course, language is not the only way to do this, right? There are many other ways. Artists do this in dance. They can do it in music, right? So I'm not saying that rhetoric is the only way, but for the Trivium and for most people, language is a really significant way of self-expression, or at least could be. And so that's where I want to leave rhetoric, is to say, I think perhaps the best way to think about it, or one good way to think about it in the modern world, is it's a lost art. It used to be considered an art. No longer. We all talk to each other all the time, but we don't think of as communication as an art form. We don't think that we really are doing anything significant. And think about that. We don't think about what we're saying and thinking and communicating as being sufficiently significant to dwell on how we're doing it. It's a self-belittling. It's a way of making ourselves small. And it's a learned process because we've learned that, again, what we say doesn't matter. And in fact, one of the things that swept the world is hip hop and rap music. And one of the things I think, I ponder why has this happened? And I go, oh, part of it is I think this notion that they really do sort of spend time with the words, right? And the sound and pattern and rhythms really matter to them. And when it's expressed, it really matters to them. And it turns out that people find that engaging, unshockingly, like they find it massively engaging. So it's not like we've lost the interest or capacity or care. It's that we've been sort of self-alienated from the process because we don't think that what we have to say, what we've experienced, what inspires us, our joys, are really all that valuable and need to be communicated in any meaningful or powerful way. And I would flip that on its head and say, no, that's probably the most valuable thing, the most important thing. And because rhetoric was important in the ancient world, because it was taught to all the people who did have the power, they had all the political power. But that doesn't mean we aren't important today, right? This is the revolution we're still waiting for. We've had, democracy in theory, in governmental structures in different ways, and we're certainly much more democratic than the ancient world. But we haven't adopted that notion that the people who are voting in the democracy actually are significant and meaningful and powerful in the way that people viewed the rare examples of the educated elite in the ancient world. And so those sorts of thought structures and approach and respect just is not there. We just had not adopted that yet. So in some ways, I think of it as an incomplete revolution. And when you think about the 3 steps of the Trivium, why they're there and how they were taught, you can see how far we've moved. Clear writing for self-expression, clear thinking so that you're not confused and you're not confusing other people, clear speaking so that you can make your ideas effective and manifest in the world because you are really, really important. No, this is not the core of our education system, and which is, of course, why I wanted to talk about the Trivium and why I think people often feel alienated from their own educations is because it's not doing this. It's doing a lot of things. You're learning things, but it's not giving you access to this sort of sense of self-power, self-expression, and opening the ancient world, all of the great texts from the globe, and making those available as models, as examples, as time spent, again, with great minds. And so this was the goal of the Trivium, and this is the modern version, if you will, of the Trivium as we've been exploring it. So the 3 parts: writing, grammar, and language use, getting that clear and using that to access literature, because history, philosophy, literature, great texts, because that allows you to understand the world and yourself, and access to great minds. Logic, to help ourselves from being deceived, either deceiving ourselves, deceiving other people, or being deceived by other people. Being able to sort the world more effectively, not perfectly. Sometimes the world is not logical, right? This is an important point, but we want to think as logically as possible. And then third, having the rhetorical capacity to then communicate with people in our lives, speak in meaningful and powerful ways, so that at least we have our own self-possession. We know ourselves better and we can express ourselves more clearly. Now, in the next section, I want to expand this a little bit and talk about some things that were not specifically part of the Trivium, that were added by the Renaissance, that were implied in the ancient world but weren't specifically there. And if you do the research, you won't find this, but it was just culturally implicit. And then finally, I want to sprinkle in just a touch of Taoism because, why not? The Tao is great. So, Trivium Part 3 on rhetoric. Thank you very much.